Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on addiction, recovery, and plurality, and what we've learned along the way. Before we get started, some trigger warnings. There will be some discussion of substance abuse, addiction, sexual boundaries, spirituality and religion, trauma and emotional abuse, shame, Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs, and clinical practices such as CBT and DBT. There will be examples of invalidating and problematic messaging, often found in recovery programs, especially transphobic messaging. There will be brief mentions of kink, cults, possible cultural appropriation, and psychiatric trauma such as ABA, and brief use of homophobic slur reclamation in our introduction. Also, an accessibility note, we've tried to leave space at the bottom of the screen for captions to display without obscuring the slide text, but we've also tried to balance this against using a large enough font size for those tuning in on phones or with limited eyesight who are reading the slides. There are a number of URLs which are long and had to be displayed in a small font, but all URLs also have a QR code for looking them up digitally in case of readability issues. Now that that's out of the way, I'll introduce us. So we are the Harmonic System. A little bit of background about us, what our plurality looks like. The vessel is white, in its late 30s, and we were raised and reside in the eastern United States. We are neurodivergent, particularly autistic, with some chronic physical conditions that have a smaller impact on daily life, some chronic mental illness that has a moderate to heavy impact on daily life. We are a mixed origin plural system of a few dozen named selves, some subsystems, additional anonymous selves, a large number of fragments, potentially other layers of headmates, and we are blendy and semi-amnesiac. Collectively, we are non-binary and trans-feminine. We reclaimed the term queer for ourselves. We are polyamorous, sex-positive, and kink-positive, though some selves are varying degrees of asexual, including some sex-repulsed selves. We collectively tend to practice nature-based spirituality, although we were raised semi-conservative Christian. I'd also like to add, we didn't grow up around a lot of substance use, so we may not have exactly the same internalized patterns and beliefs as others, which means that what's worked for us may be slightly different than what works for folks with different backgrounds. And just in general, what worked for us may not work for you, and we can't be responsible for anybody's recovery but our own, though we do aim to help others when we can with their recoveries. So what this presentation is, it is some portions of our story of addiction, recovery, and plurality. It's an overview of popular approaches to recovery that we're aware of, aiming to be path neutral. It's a discussion of the intersection of recovery concepts with plurality and how we've navigated those things. Resources for learning more about recovery and navigating plural recovery, including links to research, clinicians' opinions, and importantly, lived experience of plurals and addicts. And I should note, it is limited to our experience and knowledge, so there will be things we don't cover well or at all. Please keep that in mind. And what this presentation is not. It's not our whole recovery story, because we're still learning. It's not our whole plurality story. We are definitely still figuring ourselves out. It's not an endorsement of any one particular recovery program. It's not a collection of magic answers that will work for all systems, and it's not an exhaustive list of resources. There's definitely more out there. So let's get some terminology out of the way, at least how we've come to understand these terms. It's important to note that we're going to use addiction and recovery to talk about both chemical dependency and behavioral dependency, also known as process addiction. But not all concepts from chemical dependency treatment translate to behavioral dependency and vice versa, because the mental and neurological mechanisms involved can be somewhat different. So let's define recovery as reclaiming your life from harmful patterns of substance abuse and/or unhealthy behavior dependence, being in recovery as taking regular measures to stop these harmful patterns, sobriety as staying within the bounds of your recovery, a 12-step program as any recovery program derived from the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and addiction as repetitive destructive patterns of chemical dependency and/or harmful habitual behaviors. Note that many common sexual and romantic behaviors are sometimes labeled as addictive in popular articles, but that doesn't mean all of them necessarily are. We're also going to talk about the relevance of trauma. So the references to trauma in the presentation are not meant to limit this to the viewpoint of traumagenic systems at all. Systems of all origins can have trauma. Even just because existing as plural in a singlet-oriented world can lead to exploitation and traumatization. So it's important to be cognizant of trauma and its effects. Mental well-being is directly tied to the success of any recovery program. Trauma comes in many forms, all of which can be relevant when charting a course of recovery. It's often tied to shame, which is very important to understand in recovery and which we're going to talk about a few points later in the slides. We will be referencing how emotional abuse and boundary violation have influenced what our recovery looks like here and there. So let's talk about addiction. Addiction has a lot of facets. It has impact on the well-being of selves, health of the vessel or body, relationships within system and outside of the system, and the stability of the environment, both the inner world and the outer external environment. Addiction can influence or be influenced by beliefs about selves and the world, which is directly connected to the shame factor. And substance abuse often continues and develops into addiction because it becomes part of dysfunctional self-regulation strategies. All right, so the fun stuff, sometimes known as street cred, and we are not going to get into details here because it's not constructive to do so, but this is what our addiction looked like. Failed classes, job loss, unstable housing, losing access to transportation, financial burdens, permanent health concerns, ER trips, hospital stays, inpatient hospitalizations, rehabs, halfway houses, interacting with police and the courts. We had polysubstance abuse. We were often abusing multiple things at once, combining them in very risky ways. Engaging in high-risk behavior, including high-risk sexual behavior that disregarded the well-being of others, and we had a lot of deliberate self-sabotage in our addiction. We destroyed a lot of close relationships by taking advantage of others' concern, generosity, and forgiveness. And we're saying all this to remind every many that addiction is serious. We know how bad it can get. You're not alone. And we say that not just because it's a great plural joke, right? But because addiction is really isolating and having community is important in recovery. And just a note, being inclusive to neurodivergence here, remember that community is self-defined. It can look like any form of connection. Community for systems is also both internal and external. All right, so a little bit about our recovery history, which includes a lot of things that didn't work, but hey, that's partly on us. So we were strong-armed into some clinical dual diagnosis programs. Typically what those look like, there's some cognitive behavioral therapy for mood issues, dialectical behavioral therapy to address behaviors, group therapy, art therapy, and psych education, which includes a lot of general psychological self-awareness and addiction-type education. In denial about addiction at the time, but we did learn more about addiction and behavior patterns, relapse, recovery, triggers, and emotions. It was very helpful information. We didn't apply it. There's also a bunch of education related to social dynamics in family and relationship structures, and we definitely weren't ready to apply any of that. After that, we got involved in Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous alongside clinical measures. At that point, we were realizing that we might have a problem, but still thought we could manage it. Then the detoxes and the rehabs started, and the sober and halfway houses. We were unsuccessful at first, largely due to our reluctance to make any meaningful changes in our life. We did eventually get sober, and it's hard to say exactly what the big difference was. Environmental factors may have been part of it. Our own efforts were likely a larger part of it. Beyond AA and NA, which are the programs we were heavily involved in at first, we started looking at our addictive behaviors in S programs like Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, SLAA, and Sex Addicts Anonymous, SAA. Then, we've started going beyond 12-step groups, realizing that some aspects of AA and 12-step programs were unwelcoming for us, especially due to plurality. There's a lot of misalignment of messaging with those programs. And with our religious trauma, a lot of the stuff that we encountered in AA was particularly uncomfortable. And I want to add a quick note here. Psychiatric-only approaches may be ineffective by themselves, and CBT and DBT both have some problematic history. They may be helpful for some particular symptoms that are often comorbid with addiction, especially DBT, which can sometimes be effective with some dissociative symptoms. So some advantages and disadvantages of clinical approaches to addiction recovery. CBT can help with behavior awareness, is often effective for addiction, can even treat amnesia, but it can be ineffective for mood disorders that often co-occur with addiction. DBT can be effective for emotional regulation and behavioral change. It can also help with dissociative symptoms, but DBT materials can be invalidating to systems. CBT and DBT-based approaches can also be stressful and impersonal, or not support deeper issues. For us, autism and gender dysphoria were not even looked at when we were involved in clinical programs. And if you have psychiatric trauma like ABA, CBT and DBT may cause triggers. The focus on fixing behavior shifts responsibility largely to the patient, and while sometimes it's critical to address avoidance of responsibility in addiction, this ignores trauma as a factor. It's worth noting that plurals who already have experience working through trauma and psychological issues by focusing on triggers and responses to triggers may find it helpful to look at addiction in a triggers and behaviors model, though it can be hard to connect a purely clinical approach to a sense of meaning, purpose, and connection to the world at large, often broadly categorized as spirituality, and potentially important when considering how to exist in life in recovery, as distinct from a granular approach of changing particular details like behaviors. We wanted to provide some notes on mindfulness as it can be part of clinical approaches such as DBT or modified CBT techniques, as well as part of many non-clinical recovery programs. It's important to note that some mindfulness techniques may originate in cultural appropriation, so please research them as you come across them. Mindfulness exercises which focus on the body can be triggering for trauma victims. That is very important to be aware of. But mindfulness exercises which focus on the environment can be grounding for some systems. The links on the slide dive into the intersection of mindfulness with dissociation a little bit more, and what to be aware of for systems that have issues with dissociation and trauma around meditative and mindfulness practices. As not many may be familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-Step Recovery, we wanted to provide a little bit of background. So AA is derived originally from the 6-step plan of the Oxford Group, which was a Christian organization for life problems, expanding with more detail. The steps for AA focus on realizing the ineffectiveness of attempting to moderate or control alcoholism, honesty and confronting denial, placing a higher power in charge, coming to terms with destructive patterns, addressing past harmful behavior, focusing on spiritual connection, and doing acts of guidance. One core concept is the idea of one alcoholic helping another alcoholic. Note that AA meetings can vary significantly by country and culture, and the environment may be better or worse for some neurodivergent plurals depending on what type of meeting. There's a lot more history about AA out there, including Chapter 4 of Trauma and the 12 Steps by Dr. Jamie Marich, which is a trauma-informed approach to recovery. The entire 3rd chapter of that book is about dissociation. Dr. Marich has also recently published Dissociation Made Simple, a stigma-free guide to embracing your dissociative mind and navigating daily life, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. There are some concerns with AA that we would like to note. Much of the messaging is very Christian in nature. It can also be ableist and non-inclusive to folk from different backgrounds. AA only considers alcoholism and not addiction in general. Some AA meeting styles can be difficult for neurodivergent brains or trauma victims. Many folk in AA can have unwelcoming attitudes about mental health, despite the overlap with addiction and unwelcoming attitudes about psychiatric medication. It's worth noting that the AA General Services Conference has even published a pamphlet called AA for Alcoholics with Mental Health Issues and Their Sponsors that mentions DID and PTSD, for example, in Sherry's story, but folks in AA can still treat it as if it's an outside issue. Many AA groups can be closed-minded when it comes to matters of identity and self, potentially making them a very unwelcoming environment to plurals, which we'll talk more about later. AA originated with cisgender straight men and has often been unwelcoming to anybody else. Non-binary folk in particular might struggle to get any support due to the gender binary segregated approach to building a recovery support network that AA encourages. Though there are meetings like gay meetings that are more inclusive, and women's meetings might be more welcoming to those with a trauma history. But those may be awkward to attend if the vessel has a masculine presentation, or masculine headmates may not feel comfortable attending those meetings. Some women's meetings also only welcome cisgender women. Many 12-step programs derive from Alcoholics Anonymous. Narcotics Anonymous was created to be inclusive of all forms of chemical dependency. MARA, Medication-Assisted Recovery Anonymous, is inclusive of those who take medicine like Suboxone to support their recoveries. Al-Anon Family Groups is designed for those with family members or partners who are alcoholics. Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families is for those raised in dysfunctional homes. Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous is for sex and love addictions, as mentioned earlier. Overeaters Anonymous is for compulsive eating and food behaviors. Recovery in the Lifestyle is a kink-inclusive, self-defined 12-step sobriety program, and there are many, many more. Some of the others that are fairly well known include Cocaine Anonymous, Codependence Anonymous, Emotions Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. I could go on. Some try to address various concerns with AA, while others expand the 12-step model to other issues. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of AA, NA, and similar programs. They often have a lot of lived experience and wisdom about how to actually change your life to live in sobriety rather than just get sober and potentially relapse because your environment is not conducive to sobriety. Some studies have found that 12-step recovery has better success than clinical-only approaches. Sobriety is unfortunately often narrowly defined in these groups, leaving no wiggle room. That may be very hard for some plurals. There's a heavy focus on spirituality that goes beyond the sense of connection and wholeness and delves into Christian religious ideals in many 12-step groups. Many of the slogans are problematic for plurals, neurodivergent folk, LGBTQI+ folk, and others, and meetings can have a cult-like mentality or be mandatory in some cases. In Jack Trimpey's book Rational Recovery, The New Cure for Substance Addiction, he criticizes court-mandated or medically mandated participation in AA in Chapter 20, The Politics of Recovery. Under the heading A Humble Program of Coercion, he cites an example of a man who was forced by his medical provider to attend AA meetings in order to receive a life-saving liver transplant, despite the fact that the man had already chosen to quit drinking and likely was not even an alcoholic, just a former heavy drinker. So a lot of the ideology can be hard to translate to plurality. And if not all headmates want to approach recovery the same way, it can be very hard to agree on one program or one approach to sobriety, as well as the cult-like mentality can be dangerous for victims of ritual abuse, mind control, or organized abuse, as well as those with religious trauma or cult trauma. So let's talk about our experiences with plurality, gender, and recovery. Our system has varied genders, so our collective transness has played a part, especially as the host has changed over time. Know thyself is often said in meetings, along with the line from Shakespeare's Hamlet, to thine own self be true. That's hard to interpret when your sense of self keeps shifting due to passive influence, blurring, and blending, including your gender. One issue we had is that our transition was viewed suspiciously to the point of verbal and emotional abuse by some folk in AA being seen as fake, which created additional barriers to understanding ourselves and getting good recovery support. Authenticity is an ever-expanding topic and journey for many systems, as well as many LGBTQI+ folk. Authenticity can be a big topic in recovery. This gets extra complicated for plurals to talk about with singlets. We looked at a book by Erica Spiegelman called Rewired, A Bold New Approach to Addiction and Recovery, which highlights authenticity in the very first chapter of the book, talking about the authentic self, masking, and authentic relationships. We thought the mentions of authentic self and masking were very curious, not just because we're a system, but also because we're autistic, and we mention that book again later. We personally have different beliefs about deities and higher powers, but we don't necessarily have to have identical conceptions of a higher power across the system to use a sense of higher power in our recovery. We try to keep our sense of spirituality more open-ended, and it's okay if higher power differs from headmate to headmate. As long as it's something that works for that headmate, then we can stay in recovery together. In early sobriety, I'm pretty sure that our higher power was a headmate in the system. General plural concerns with support in recovery. Finding support is hard when plural. Many recovery programs focus on single gender support networks or sponsors or accountability partners that are the same gender as you. That might be a nonsense idea for plurals or even some trans non-binary folk. The change everything approach to building a new sober life could displace you from the support network you've built that actually understands you and your plurality, and it could be destabilizing to the headmates who aren't struggling as much with addiction. Some recovery programs discount the importance of mental health treatment, and that's often a very important part of many system support networks. And coming back to general plural concerns for recovery and identity. Aphorisms like, "you're a drunk like everyone else in this room," are tantamount to identity erasure and alienating to plurals, as well as disabled, neurodivergent, LGBTQI+, and other folks. Some hardcore or old school AA groups insist on the concept of tearing down and rebuilding identity because who you were wasn't working, who you were kept getting drunk. And they'll often tell newcomers, you don't even know who you are yet, which is a lot like gaslighting and can be destabilizing to plurals and trans folk. In particular, that line was used on us when we were starting to transition, and it was troubling to hear. And some plural concerns for recovery and system trust. Many 12-step derived programs incorporate some idea of a higher power, insisting that it's because an alcoholic or addict cannot trust themselves. This can really discourage systems from improving communication and building trust internally, and it's really tricky if you have religious trauma or for plurals that are spiritual gateway systems. Some systems may have headmates that are actually spirits, angels, deities, or similar. System trust starts with working together. Harm reduction agreements can be a good way forward to do that. Power greater than myself is wording often found in 12-step programs. And for systems, that could map to the idea of the system working together to stay in recovery, potentially. That depends on the system. There are a lot of resources out there for developing system trust, so please check them out. Plural concerns for personal inventory step work. AA and similar have a moral inventory fourth step, which lists conflicts and problems, identifying harmful patterns of behavior by the alcoholic. It's then shared with somebody else. Taking stock of character in this fashion is meant to make the alcoholic confront denial of the harm they do for accountability, but the focus is on blaming self. Blaming selves for bad situations is not a trauma-informed model. It doesn't account for others causing harm, intended or not, and further stigmatizes harmful behavior learned from abusers. Also, amnesiac systems may not be able to produce a complete inventory, or this could lead to trauma being uncovered that could be destabilizing for plurals. Many sponsors are not trauma aware, and some may insist an alcoholic played a part in situations where they were victims. This just adds gaslighting on top of abuse. Hurt people is important to remember when recognizing and changing patterns of intergenerational and similar harm, but this approach ignores that by not having compassion for learning harmful patterns from an abuser and internalizing them. Note that having compassion does not mean condoning those behaviors, but compassion can go a long way towards headmates working together on a goal like recovery. This is one strategy of ours that we use for examining harm. We developed this strategy in an attempt to make sense of complex dynamics during a really messy relationship, examining our part in a neutral way, then the other party's part in a neutral way, and finally combine them to try to make a nuanced judgment of the situation. The example: we were in active addiction and began manipulating others around us, including the other person in this relationship. We were also struggling at the time with the desire to transition and not having support for that. When we were physically assaulted by the partner, we acted in self-defense. Their part? That partner depended upon us for help. They became aggressive and violent sometimes when our desire for transition was mentioned, and that partner injured us many times. Combining those, we recognize that we are responsible for being manipulative in our addiction, and we recognize that our ex-partner is responsible for the abuse they inflicted. By separating our part and their part, it prevents the situation from being too overwhelming to understand, but then we combine it together at the end in order to make sense of it and determine accountability. Plural concerns for making amends step work. AA and similar have 9th and 10th steps where a list of everyone harmed is created, then amends are made when possible. This, along with the 11th step of continuing to take personal inventory and admitting fault, are part of accountability, but they do ignore trauma. Many 12-step sponsors may not be trauma-informed enough to realize you shouldn't make amends to an abuser. Some special interest meetings may help here. Women's meetings and gay meetings may be better places to find sponsors that are aware of this. AA does have a provision for a living amends when contact would cause further damage by the alcoholic, where the alcoholic changes their own behaviors to avoid causing similar harm in the future. But sometimes fighting back is necessary to escape an abuser. So if an abusive situation occurs again in the future, then that would have to be considered when planning any sort of living amends for behaviors. And finally, some additional concerns with 12-step programs. Recovery environments of a lot of 12-step programs have a third tradition, where the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking or stop using or be in recovery. That means that former abusers or even active abusers may be in attendance in meetings. Recovery meeting organizers have a responsibility under the third tradition to ensure that meeting rooms are an inclusive place and thus should not tolerate abuse within the rooms of the meetings itself. However, that does not prevent active abusers from attending the meetings. Some special interest meeting groups may try to keep out active abusers under the primary purpose fifth tradition of ensuring the message reaches those who still suffer if the meeting's focus is on marginalized groups particularly affected by abuse, such as women's meetings or gay meetings. It's also important to make sure that the attendees of recovery groups are not glossing over previous harms done and failing to recognize the seriousness of them. That could be a red flag for attending that particular group. Finally, many slogans also may reinforce trauma, such as "take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth," or "feelings are not facts," which can be particularly dismissive to trauma victims, echoing gaslighting. The aforementioned book, Trauma and the 12 Steps, gives a more complete analysis under the section Mind the Slogans and Recovery Small Talk in Chapter 5. So why do we share all that? Alcoholics Anonymous has helped some folk, and it helped us a good bit. If you choose to seek out AA or similar types of programs, we want you to be prepared. If you are seeking recovery that is different from AA, we'd like to help draw attention to the ways other recovery programs may improve upon the downsides of AA. Sometimes looking at these types of issues can serve as good jumping off points to understand what you need in a recovery program. Now here's some variations on 12-step concepts. We'll start with self-defined sobriety. The 3-circle model from Sex Addicts Anonymous, and there's a worksheet link included, looks at acting out behaviors that you must abstain from, putting those in the inner circle. behaviors which may lead to acting out behaviors, placing those in the middle circle, and behaviors that enhance your recovery, placing those in the outer circle. This is also sometimes called red, yellow, green, like a traffic light. In other words, the outer circle keeps you spiritually fit and sober, the middle circle could lead you back to the inner circle, and the inner circle is where sobriety goes to die, as it were. Often placing behaviors into different circles involves measuring harm, which can be tricky. So programs that use the three circles model often focus on reviewing the aforementioned personal inventory with a sponsor or accountability partner in order to classify behaviors and define sobriety. When behaviors have risks that can be mitigated, it may be important to consider whether skipping risk assessment and mitigation belongs in the inner circle. Systems may need to consider that different headmates may need different boundaries around problem behaviors as long as those behaviors don't affect the rest of the system too much. We've personally pondered about how to handle boundaries potentially in circles. For example, letting others dictate our boundaries instead of setting healthy boundaries for ourselves could be something we'd put in the middle circle, as codependency can be a warning signal for us. A similar model is top and bottom lines, and this is used by Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Bottom lines are harmful behaviors you must refrain from, whereas top lines are new healthy behaviors you choose to do instead. And there's a worksheet link as well. More variations around 12-step concepts with defining sobriety. While AA defines sobriety around alcohol and NA defines sobriety around mood-altering and mind-changing chemicals, other programs may define sobriety in many other ways. Psychedelics in Recovery is a group for folks in recovery interested in integrating intentional psychedelic use. There is one story about that may include some elements of cultural appropriation as it discusses ayahuasca. There is a link to that story on the slide. The book Dissociation Made Simple, which incidentally in Chapter 2 mentions addiction issues as a possible response to childhood trauma, in Chapter 6 discusses psychedelics and healing as well as using the 12 steps in healing. When engaging in intentional substance use meant to enhance recovery, it is important to keep in mind the possibility of a slippery slope, whether substance use could lead back to problem substances or problem behaviors, or develop into new problem substances or behaviors. Another example of an alternate definition for sobriety is Medication-Assisted Recovery Anonymous, which is a medication-inclusive program for addicts who use medication in recovery. And Recovery in the Lifestyle is open to all definitions of sobriety, and it is a kink-inclusive recovery meeting. We have found Riddle to be particularly welcoming to us being polyamorous, which is part of how we personally manage relationships as a system. Riddle does tend to have sexual triggers, plus it could be highly uncomfortable for sex-repulsed headmates. Another variation on 12-step concepts is different attitudes. The harsh attitude sometimes found in AA can help spur reluctant addicts into enough action to get sober, but they can be very off-putting to many addicts and alcoholics. NA step workbooks take a much more detailed look at the 12 steps, encouraging reflection over a longer period, which is helpful for some addicts. Trauma-informed, non-shaming literature and workbooks may also help when there are family of origin issues that tie into addiction, or trauma and shame in general. Two examples are Stephanie S. Covington's A Woman's Way Through the 12 Steps and Patrick J. Carnes' A Gentle Path Through the 12 Steps. Dr. Covington has also written other materials on self-empowerment and reclaiming sexuality that may be of interest, and Dr. Carnes has written on sexual addiction. Some plurals may find that they would like to consider safer substance use as a strategy. This can be highly risky if not approached with caution. It could also potentially be a good way of getting buy-in from headmates who are not on board with a total abstinence program. When examining safer substance use, it's important to consider dose, frequency, purpose, risks involved, including the risk of relapse, how helpful it is short-term versus long-term. It's also important to consider the degrees of risk within a category of behaviors if used for behavioral addiction, reusing the three circles model. For example, there may be degrees of safe indulgence of some types of behaviors that could go in a middle circle, but degrees of unsafe indulgence that go in the inner circle. A system working together on a harm reduction strategy can directly support a mutually agreed upon definition of recovery. There is a great presentation on harm reduction that we mentioned earlier, aired last year from Volpes Automata, and the link is there. For systems with a lot of amnesia, getting cooperation across the system on recovery may be greatly enhanced by getting headmates to align on some degree of safer substance use by employing a harm reduction agreement. Depending on system amnesia, it may be necessary to adjust what constitutes a slip in order for the system to have a workable definition of what it means to be in recovery. Now we'd like to talk about some alternatives to the 12 steps entirely, addressing further concerns and additional plurality challenges. There are many recovery program alternatives to the 12 steps. Rational recovery is often recommended as an alternative, but we found when reviewing the materials, especially chapters 11 and 16, the addictive voice recognition technique labels addictive tendencies as the beast or the addictive voice. The framing seemed like a headmate that you're supposed to ignore or suppress, which sounded to us risky for a plural system, and potentially confusable with internal persecutors who need understanding rather than being ignored, or aggressive protectors who would benefit from improving the tools in their toolbox. And we will come back to the subject of dealing with internal persecutors in a few more slides. The book, as we mentioned earlier, is by Jack Trimpey, and it takes a critical look at not just some of the downsides of AA, but common rehab teachings. For example, chapter 13, looking at how some rehabs insist that post-acute withdrawal in early sobriety or after relapse prevents you from thinking clearly for 6 months. That's a common rehab teaching that could set systems up for gaslighting. And chapter 14 points out other recovery programs sometimes try to label every personality trait as an addictive trait, which is a very good point. So despite the fact that some of the methods for working with the addictive voice sound like tulpamancy, potentially complicating recovery efforts for a system, there is a lot of good discussion on recovery techniques taught in AA and rehabs in the book. Interestingly enough, at least to us as a plural system, chapter 14 mentions hearing voices at least in a clinical context, though in a very brief way which isn't expanded upon. The same chapter later talks about authentic self, which can be a tricky phrase for plurals. We mentioned Rewired earlier by Erica Spiegelman. This book highlights the principles of authenticity, honesty, evolution or growing, solitude, relationship with self or selves, time management, which could be tricky, self-care, healthy relationships, gratitude, compassion, and love. These are literally the chapter titles for the book. It focuses on applying concepts of recovery through affirmations, bringing up the importance of self-care and compassion. The ending of the book focuses on affirmations and intentions, some of which do seem to be trauma-aware, followed by a message of hope. We thought finding purpose through process in the evolution chapter was interesting in how it looked at finding purpose, though the next section, combating the inner critic, mentioned treating intrusive thoughts almost like a headmate, so be cautious with that. Another alternative to the 12 steps is SMART Recovery, which stands for Self-Management and Recovery Training. The 4 main points are motivation, urges, self-management, and balance. The website offers lots of exercises and worksheets. For example, the role-play exercise could be adaptable for plurals to allow headmates to help each other practice risk management, though it is possible a system could spiral into endless anxious conversational rehearsal that way, so be careful. We like the idea of all the exercises and worksheets as it's particularly suited to our brand of autism. There's a big focus on unconditional self-acceptance, which is great. Some of the exercises may tie in well with clinical approaches. There are worksheets for cost-benefit analysis and disputing irrational beliefs, and a link to that website is on the slide. Another alternative to the 12 steps is the book Recovery Dharma. It's based on Buddhist teachings around understanding the nature of suffering and the wisdom of the Eightfold Path. There's a heavy focus on mindfulness and meditation. Note that at least one of the meditations focuses on awareness of body sensations, which is potentially triggering for trauma victims, as discussed earlier. Though the discussion on the first noble truth does seem to consider trauma and attachment in a trauma-informed way. Discussion on wise intention includes compassion for self. There are potential cultural appropriation concerns, though the Recovery Dharma book page on Facebook did post on November 27, 2022, updated wording that may partly address those, as well as a commitment to non-discrimination and inclusion. We are not experts on cultural appropriation, so we would encourage any systems interested to do some research. There are many other alternatives out there. While researching, we found many options, but we didn't have the time to investigate more than a few. One interesting example we found was Infinite Recovery Handbook by Keith Keller, which focuses on building your own recovery beyond the 12-step model, with a focus on becoming an upgraded version of yourself and changing your thinking, refocusing thoughts, and learning on recovery. It expands on many 12-step ideas with a focus on flexibility that some folk might find helpful. The Pillars of Recovery chapter particularly focused on action, change, and community. At some point, we had to stop buying and skimming through books and actually make this presentation, so there's a lot out there we didn't even get to look at. Connecting with other plurals who are in recovery may help you find additional programs and resources. So I know we've just dumped a lot of information, which raises the question of how do you deal with no one-size-fits-all. Mixing and matching parts of different recovery programs has pros and cons. It may give the flexibility some plurals need for headmates to agree on a recovery plan, but it also is easy to fall into the trap of low accountability for an eclectic recovery program, as the external community for supporting that may be kind of patchwork in nature. For all programs, accountability partners will help with honesty. Accountability partners internal to and external to the system have different advantages that vary by system structure and function. Having both is likely best when possible. And internal accountability can build upon shared system responsibility and harm reduction agreements. Note that it may be easier to be honest with the rest of the system, for some systems, but it may be harder for them to hold you accountable, for example, if you never give up front to your accountability headmate. Headmates who stay co-conscious or who have good awareness of events may be able to help with accountability across the system. External accountabilities, like sponsors, can also be helpful for systems with a lot of amnesia if headmates are willing to at least speak honestly with an external accountability partner. And that brings us to commitment, getting buy-in from the rest of the system. In order for a plural to commit to a recovery program, headmates need to be willing to go along with it. Enthusiasm can be contagious. Headmates showing leadership around recovery may help with some systems, and there's more resources out there for enthusiasm and leadership. It may be helpful for some systems to focus on convincing headmates how recovery will benefit them. Be prepared to compromise or meet adversarial headmates where they are. The Retired Persecutors talk, aired at last year's PPWC, may be helpful. It especially deals with forming relationships with persecutors. And if some headmates present a challenge with buy-in, it may be helpful to bring the conversation back around to system responsibility. If the vessel is in a jail cell, then no one is going to have any fun. So that's all well and good if there are no slips in recovery, but what about relapse? Let's talk about relapse and shame. Shame plays a huge role in addiction, especially for folks who have relapsed and are struggling to re-enter recovery. There's a great presentation about shame from last year's PPWC, and the link is there for that. We personally have a fawning response and tend to capitulate to the requests of others. That makes it easy for us to deprioritize our recovery, putting us at risk of relapse. We have to remind ourselves that we're in this for ourselves so that we can live in recovery rather than suffer in addiction. We also have a lot of negative beliefs about ourselves, and one of the things that we've tried to work on is forming healthier beliefs, such as recognizing that missteps can happen and learning from them leads to fewer missteps in the future. Can happen is passive wording, but that's not an attempt to dodge accountability. That's recognizing the fact that systems can be messy. We are quite blendy. We try to approach problems with a blameless failure analysis and lessons learned, so that we can integrate the lessons with personal growth and our therapeutic environment, which can be therapy and supportive community. Even though tracing the causes of missteps can be challenging in a system, especially a Blendy system, analyzing missteps must still be approached with accountability. Again, on accountability and belief, we don't count time because it gives us major anxiety, but we do our best to stay in recovery. Accountability is still important, even if you choose not to count days sober. And a little more on what blameless analysis means to us is we try not to start internal fights over missteps. System responsibility is shared, so we attempt to approach it as a team to figure out what we could collectively do differently next time to change the outcome. It's important to recognize that shame can worsen addictive behaviors. drawing us towards exploitative situations deeper and deeper down the bad behavior and shame rabbit hole. This can lead to reinforcement of patterns of traumatization, so we try to stay away from that. And one of the most effective ways we are finding to stop shame, besides recognizing it, is countering it with compassion. If you're struggling or you relapse, have compassion for yourselves. Again, if you're struggling or you relapse, have compassion for yourselves. One more time, if you're struggling or you relapse, have compassion for yourselves. It's not a mistake that we said that 3 times. Having compassion is not the same as condoning. It doesn't mean that you're excusing yourselves of accountability. Compassion counters shame and self-judgment. It also encourages empathy, which can increase willingness for headmates to coordinate together on recovery. So that all being said, where do we go from here? Planning and connection. It's important to create a recovery plan for yourselves with reasonable goals that call you to action. In the book Trauma and the 12 Steps, Chapter 7 has examples of trauma-informed strategies for connecting with community and enhancing coping skills and mindfulness. And activity and movement can engage lower parts of the brain that are good for learning new patterns. There's a lot more on this in Chapter 10 of the same book. See also the discussion of the triune brain in The Body Keeps the Score, which discusses the relationship to dissociation as well. Having support is essential. Remember that you're allowed to take up space, as much space as you need for your recovery. Find community where you can, inside and out. Be cognizant of your social spoons, and remember that community can take many shapes. And some final notes on plural recovery. It's really important to keep system stability in mind. Be aware where recovery programs will intersect with neurodivergence, trauma, aspects of plurality and identity, etc. Consider the implications for plurality for the things you hear in recovery programs. Be ready to think about how to translate some singlet speak for your system. And if you're able to find ways to tie your recovery work into general system work, this may help both types of work reinforce each other and promote deeper healing. Though fully combining them may be inadvisable, as it may be overwhelming and cause some system progress to suffer in the event of a relapse. Finally, we'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day for our presentation. We may be reached by email, harmonicsys@yahoo.com. Please reach out to some many if you need support. And we'll leave you with this quote from Johann Hari's TED Talk, "The opposite of addiction is connection." Thank you for allowing us to share with you today.